BBV2M LLC Development Series, Developing Your Competitive Advantage. Developing your competitive advantage, similar to a race. What is your competitive advantage? Competitive advantage is a business concept describing attributes that allows an organization to outperform its competitors. These attributes may include access to natural resources, such as high-grade oil or inexpensive power, highly skilled personnel, geographic locations, or high entry barriers, just to name a few. Competitive advantage is also a concept describing attributes that allows you as an individual to outperform others. In the definition of competitive advantage for businesses, one of the key attributes that can give a business a competitive advantage is having highly skilled personnel. We often talk about this in athletics, where individuals may be practicing or doing the same things at the same time. And we say, what is it that you're doing that separates you from everyone else? If everyone else is practicing at the same time, if everyone else is doing the same things, what gives you a greater advantage over them? And that requires going above and beyond what everyone else is doing. Do you have a competitive advantage over others? If so, what do you feel is your advantage? Some examples are skills, knowledge base, charisma, teamwork, strategic ability, tactical execution, etc. All of these things can give an individual a competitive advantage. Everyone doesn't have the same skills. Everyone doesn't have the same knowledge base. Everyone doesn't have the same charisma. Teamwork is not equally distributed among everyone. Strategic ability is not the same, nor is tactical execution. Think about it from this standpoint. If you're in school, why is it if everyone is doing the same studying, hearing the same information, doesn't everyone get an A? Okay. That makes it kind of simple there if you stop and think about it. And the same thing happens in the workplace or in business. We all have a different advantage that allows us to be competitive. Now, the question becomes whether we're using that advantage or if we even understand that advantage. And if we understand that advantage, what is it that we're doing to improve it, to hone on in on it, to really truly leverage it for success or for allowing us to be more competitive versus someone else? As we mentioned before, there are some key things that we need to kind of get out on the table when we're talking about your competitive advantage, and some key questions we must all answer. And one of those is, do you leverage your competitive advantage well? Do you truly understand it and utilizing it in a way that truly gives you an advantage? Do you look to improve or enhance your competitive advantage? It's one thing to know you have an advantage, but you can't sit there on your laurels with it. You have to improve it. You have to engage it. You have to explore it. You have to pursue it in order for it to continue to be an advantage for you. There's many people have advantages over others, but over time, others close that gap and eventually pass them if they're not improving or enhancing that advantage. Do you constantly vet it versus others? You know, in business, we often talk about doing gap assessments. How do we stack up against our competitors? How do we stack up against other businesses? How do we stack up in other industries? Athletes, you know, if you're in track and field, you look at what other times that other athletes may have and how you compare to that. The same thing applies when we're talking about our competitive advantage. Are we constantly vetting it versus others? And then going back to the other two questions we asked, If we're vetting it, are we leveraging it the right way? Are we improving or enhancing on it? Those become key if we want to continue to have a competitive advantage. But even in the vetting process, there's something you have to think about. Do others have a competitive advantage over us? If so, are you aware of what they are? How does it affect your ability to do your job if someone else has a competitive advantage over you? Do you look in your vetting process and say, can I overcome it? Or is the impact large or small on your own capabilities? So if I'm an athlete or I'm a competitor, in let's say any type of sports, uh, I may know someone may have greater abilities than I may have, but then that means I'm going to work to close that gap to reduce their competitive advantage over me. And at the same time, I am going to leverage my own capabilities that give me a competitive advantage. If I never look to close the gap, then I may have an issue that I can't overcome. Think about Coca-Cola and Pepsi. Coca-Cola originally started off with a tremendously large gap on Pepsi. Pepsi closed that gap, with a series of taste tests that they would do across the country to make them sure that they were directly in competition with Coke. Now, yeah, Coke had a slip up as it relates to one of their marketing strategies, but prior to that, Pepsi was closing that gap. It's no different than Wendy's, Burger King, Subway, all did on McDonald's. McDonald's started off with a pretty good gap or a pretty good advantage on all of those companies, but they found a way to close that gap, and they did that by vetting themselves against their competition. And that's really what you want to do as you look at how others may have a competitive advantage over you and how you close that. Strengths versus competitive advantage. A strength can be a competitive advantage. However, a strength can also not be a competitive advantage. Being good at something doesn't necessarily mean that you are better than someone else in it or can outperform someone else in it. And that's the difference. So I may be fast, but if everyone that I'm running against is faster than I am, then my speed it doesn't give me an advantage. So a strength on some cases may allow you to have a competitive advantage. In other senses, it may not. So you really need to understand your strengths versus your competitive advantage. You do want to build upon your strengths. You want to close the gap on your weaknesses, but you most definitely want to take advantage and leverage your competitive advantage as well as vetting that against others. But in order to do that, it all starts with self awareness. We have to develop a good understanding of our capabilities. We have to know our strengths and weaknesses. We have to assess our abilities against others, as we talked about in the vetting process, that may have a competitive advantage over you in certain key areas that could hinder your personal success. But beyond that, we can do all of those things. But if we don't develop and execute a plan to close those gaps, if they're hindering our success, then we will always be behind. So self awareness becomes a platform to allow us to move forward and then execute on a plan to close those gaps or to leverage our competitive advantage. We've talked about personal brand in another one of the BBV2M LLC DS series, but you always ensure that your competitive advantage is highlighted in your personal brand. Whether it's in an interview process, whether you're trying to get a contract in business, you want to make sure people understand that part of your brand is tied to your competitive advantage. Okay, if you think about certain businesses that have a competitive advantage in service, or in manufacturing capabilities, or as GE used to really talk about in leadership. You want to make sure those things are highlighted. If it is not, then ask yourself, should it be? Is it truly a competitive advantage? But your personal brand is truly a key component of developing your competitive advantage and being a part of your competitive advantage. Thanks once again for watching this BBV2M DS series on competitive advantage. BBV2M DS is a product of Brothers Brooks Vision to Mission LLC, and we'll see you with the next video.